to today's lecture on the late period in Egypt. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to take a look at the last years of Egyptian rule in Egypt. We've already seen that with the third intermediate period, foreign rule by both Libyans and Nubians was becoming more and more common, even if they did adopt some of the conventions of traditional Egyptian kings. Now, during the late period, we'll see that the theme continues as native Egyptians do battle with the Persians for the right to rule the Nile River Valley and Delta. So whether you're trying to preserve independence or you want to govern your homeland from Persepolis, journey with me as we investigate late period Egypt. The third intermediate period ended in war, not between Egyptians and Egyptians, or even between Egyptians and foreigners, but rather between the Nubians who ruled Egypt in the 25th dynasty and the Assyrians, a foreign empire from Mesopotamia that was known for its powerful siege engines and its gruesome terror tactics, like impaling people on spikes and flaying people alive. These reliefs showed just how bad it could get for people who resisted the Assyrians in the middle of the 7th century BCE, and Egypt was in just that position. In 665 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal swooped into Egypt and defeated the Nubian king to take control of Lower Egypt in the north. 2 years later, he was at the doorstep of Thebes. And in 663 BCE, aided by the local leader Psamtik from the Egyptian city of Sais, Ashurbanipal defeated the Nubian king once again. Afterwards, to reward Psamtik for his help in the overthrow of Nubian rule, the Assyrian leader put Psamtik in charge of Egypt as a vassal king. Psamtik, it turned out, didn't have an interest in the quote-unquote vassal part of his kingship. And soon he rebelled against the Assyrians, throwing off their imperial hegemony. In doing so, he became the first king of the 26th dynasty, and of the large epic we call the late period in Egypt. Next, Psamtik headed down to Thebes to crush the rising Nubian power, and he forced the current high priestess of Amun to adopt his daughter as the next high priestess. With that move, Psamtik reunited political, military, and religious power within a single position, and he ruled powerfully and effectively for more than 50 years. The 26th dynasty rulers all hailed from the hometown of Psamtik, the city of Sais in Lower Egypt. They became powerful enough to once again start exerting power outside the bounds of the Nile River Valley and Delta. And when the Assyrians were crushed by the Babylonians, they made a strong play to gain influence in Mesopotamia. To do so, they started hiring mercenaries, and the Greeks played an especially important role here. And even though they lost badly to the Babylonians, the sheer fact that they could make an expedition like that was progress from where they previously were. On the artistic front, the 26th dynasty, or the Saite period as Egyptologists call it, looks backwards towards the Old Kingdom in a process known as archaism. So the pharaohs gained strength by modeling themselves on their Old Kingdom forebears. The 26th dynasty was relatively successful, lasting for over 100 years. But the rising powers of the Near East were too powerful for Egypt to hold off in perpetuity. Just as the Assyrians fell to the Babylonians in turn fell to the Persians, led by their first king, Cyrus the Great. Persian expansion then continued at an incredibly rapid rate, and shortly after the death of Cyrus, his successor, Cambyses, invaded Egypt looking to make it part of the burgeoning Persian Empire.
Now, if there's one thing to know about Cambyses, it's that this guy is crazy. He rolls into Egypt in 525 BCE, and he has his soldiers paint cats on their shields. And he had a horde of stray cats go in front of his army, holding them out in front of the army, because he had heard a rumor that the Egyptians worshipped cats. According to one source, it actually worked, and the Egyptians submitted, not wanting to harm the embodiment of their goddess Bastet. Thus Cambyses founded the 27th dynasty, a line of Persian kings ruling Egypt.
Once in charge, things didn't get much better. He stabbed and killed the Apis bull, the sacred bull of Memphis. He went on to defile and burn the corpse of the earlier pharaoh Amasis. After that, he ends up marrying two of his own sisters. Hey, this is Egypt and brother-sister marriage is the norm, he says. But then he goes on to kill one of them when she dared to criticize him for killing his own brother. He was always paranoid, and he would bury Persian noblemen upside down to prevent a revolt. And he then shot the son of the nobleman right through the heart with an arrow, while the kids of that father watched on.
So Cambyses was a crazy Persian dude, right? Not so fast, my friend. Once again, it's important to consider biases when interpreting these sources. These stories all come from the Greek historian Herodotus, and the Greeks were upset with the Persians for attacking their own homeland years earlier. Also, Herodotus is known for his tendency to embellish. Luckily, we've got some contemporary Egyptian sources that mention Cambyses as well. And they say that he played the role of pharaoh pretty well, in fact. He took an Egyptian name. He depicted himself as an Egyptian pharaoh. He married his sisters just like an Egyptian pharaoh would. And he generally was fond of Egyptian culture and kingship. So be careful when you're interpreting these ancient sources and make sure to account for any biases that may exist.
According to Herodotus, crazy Cambyses killed himself when he heard about a revolt brewing in the Persian homeland. He jumped on his horse, ready to ride for home. But in doing so, he stabbed himself in the leg, right in the same spot he was rumored to have stabbed the Apis bull. And he bled to death before he ever made it back home. Now, most people think this is probably just Herodotus making up a story to highlight how he felt about Cambyses. But it does seem that just a few years after conquering Egypt, Cambyses did die on the way back to Persia, on his way there to quell a revolt.
The Persian leader, Darius I, was the winner of that revolt, and he went on to become the king of Persia after Cambyses' death. We think in part that he didn't have a legitimate claim on the Persian throne because of numerous steps that he took to justify his rule. Actually, trying to justify it was evidence that he didn't legitimately have it. So, most dramatically, he set up an inscription at the site of Behistun, describing how he's related to Cyrus and to the gods. The inscription itself is incredibly important for ancient historians because it's the same text written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. And this was a massive help for translating cuneiform. You could kind of think of this as like the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform texts. Pretty cool stuff.
Despite his unusual ascent to the throne, Darius was a strong and able leader for the Persian Empire. Rather than go around killing bulls and wives in Egypt, Darius ruled the Nile River Valley and Delta from afar. Nevertheless, he paid attention to Egypt, its customs and its culture, and spent a significant amount of resources rebuilding the temples of Egypt and even founding new ones.
Darius, however, lost to the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon, and his successor Xerxes was hell-bent on trying to avenge that loss. He started to pull resources from all over the empire to utilize on his invasion of Greece. Unsurprisingly, as Persian control of Egypt waned, revolts started to spring up, and eventually, in 411 BCE, the Egyptians were able to throw off Persian rule, at least partially.
The revolts against the Persians eventually led to the ascension of Amarteus of Sais, the same city that Psamtik once ruled. As the first Egyptian king in quite some time, Amarteus was the first king of the 28th dynasty, and his rule was a turning point. But while Egyptians may have liked the fact that Egyptians were once again ruling Egypt, they weren't able to agree on which Egyptian should do the job. He ruled for a mere 5 years, and then he was defeated in battle by Nefertiti, and then gruesomely executed on his way back to Memphis.
Now, Nefertiti started the 29th dynasty and ruled from his hometown of Mendes in the Nile Delta area. We actually have some evidence of Nefertiti getting a building program off the ground, building a chapel at Acharis, adding once again to Karnak, and a sphinx of his was brought to Europe in the 16th century, eventually finding its way into the Louvre. But despite this nascent construction, Nefertiti's power didn't last. A few pharaohs followed him, but in the end, the 29th dynasty only lasted 18 years. But I guess that's better than the 5 measly years of the 28th dynasty, so you got that going for you, 29th dynasty.
The final ruler of the 29th dynasty, Nefertiti II, was overthrown by yet another Egyptian, Nectanebo I. And out of all the late period pharaohs, Nectanebo, the first king of the 30th dynasty, put together the most impressive building program. You can almost feel his desire to connect with the mighty pharaohs of the old, middle, and new kingdoms. His temple to the goddess of Isis still stands tall at the site of Philae in the far south of Egypt, and he built the first pylon at the temple of Amun at Karnak. In addition to Philae and Karnak, Nectanebo built at Sais and Hermopolis and Edfu as well, a remarkably robust building program.
Nectanebo even had success defending Egypt from the Persians. When the Persians invaded the Nile Delta with their fleet, Nectanebo blocked the main path to Memphis. And while the Persians were taking a detour, the Nile flood took out the whole Persian fleet, saving the day for Nectanebo and the Egyptians. But his successors couldn't hold off the Persians forever. The last Egyptian king of Egypt, Nectanebo II, ruled from 360 to 343 BCE, before he was overthrown by the Persian king Artaxerxes III. Afterwards, he fled to Nubia, and his ultimate fate has been lost to the sands of time.
The Persians ruled Egypt once again as the 31st dynasty, starting in 343 BCE. And once again, just like under the rule of Darius, Egypt was ruled as a satrapy or province. But Persian rule didn't last long. This time it wasn't an internal revolt or an invasion from Libya or Nubia that overthrew Persian rule, but rather a young man from Macedon by the name of Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great came to power in Greece at the ripe young age of 16, when his father was murdered at his own wedding. Yeesh. After quickly quelling rebellion by the Greeks, Alexander crossed the Hellespont and took his small Greek army against the Persians, the greatest empire the world had ever seen up until this point. Amazingly, he was incredibly successful right from the start. He won battles at Granicus, he cut the Gordian knot, he defeated Darius III at Issus, he laid siege to the island city of Tyre, and he eventually made his way south into Egypt.
Once in Egypt, the Persian satrap, or governor, didn't even put up a fight. He just handed over the Egyptian treasury to Alexander. That turned out to be a pretty smart move. Alexander let him live, and even made him part of the new administration. Alexander then sailed south on the Nile to the ancient capital of Memphis, where, according to Greek historians, he was proclaimed king and liberator of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt that is, as well as taking the title of Son of the Gods, which he would soon start to take a little too seriously. He stayed and ruled in Memphis for 2 months, restoring religious monuments throughout Egypt at sites like Karnak and Luxor, where he'd depict himself in the classical Egyptian manner, as a traditional pharaoh.
Alexander then headed back north, and there he selected the location for a new city to be built, Alexandria, which would soon become one of the greatest, most populous, most cosmopolitan, best educated cities in the entire Hellenistic world, thanks to wonders like the famous lighthouse and the great library. To conclude his trip, Alexander headed west to the Siwa Oasis, way far out into the desert. There, he visited the temple and oracle of Amun. And after entering the Holy of Holies, the deepest sanctuary, he emerged saying that the oracle did indeed confirm that he was the son of a god. The Greeks had taken Egypt, and Alexander continued on his quest. The late period in Egypt, much like the Third Intermediate period, is a struggle between different cultural groups for supreme rule of the Nile River Valley and Delta. The Egyptians of the 26th dynasty fight with the Persians of the 27th dynasty, and the Egyptians of the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties all fight with each other. But at this point, the battle was moot. Greater empires ruled the Mediterranean and Near East. And as Alexander the Great showed the world, Egypt was just one stop in the quest for world domination. Nonetheless, it's important that Alexander, like Darius and Cambyses before him, didn't try to change everything about Egyptian culture and kingship. Instead, he tried to adopt the traditional conventions of kingship, but for his own purposes. So if you're trying to rule from afar, don't be afraid to do as the locals do. Put on your Egyptian crown and rule like the pharaohs of yore. Just a couple lessons you can learn from late period Egypt.